welcome, Kendall. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you for those of you who are watching this live on Facebook, or if you are watching this on YouTube, thank you so much for tuning in. You're watching this episode of The Young Professionista, and in it, we will be covering how students can improve their study strategies and their well-being even during a pandemic. I know both of those elements have been pretty tough, especially in a distance learning environment or a hybrid learning environment, or even if you're in a normal learning environment now, but still going through the ramifications of a pandemic, then you'll get so much from this interview that we're about to go into in just a moment. My name is Mary Grace Gardner, and I am a college admissions and career coach at The Young Professionista, where I help students with finding their passions and writing compelling application essays so that they can apply to the college of their dreams with confidence. And today I am interviewing Erin Kendall Brown, founder of Faulkner Academic Strategies. She graduated summa cum laude from Columbia University and managed to do so while working in a top-tier research lab, having fun with her friends, and getting a full night of sleep almost every night. So I know as hardworking students who are watching this, or parents of hardworking students, that is the goal, to be able to do well in school, but also get a full night of sleep and enjoy outside activities and time with friends and family. So Kendall will be sharing with us exactly how she has done it and how she has helped other students learn how to do that as well. And so she then went on to get her PhD at Columbia, studying learning and memory. And now she uses both her scientific expertise and her practical firsthand experience to help students learn how to study more effectively so that they can get top grades without sacrificing their well-being. Kendall, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Mary Grace.
And so if you're watching this live, let us know if you've got questions or comments in the comments below on Facebook. If you're watching this on the replay on YouTube, let us know if you've got comments and we'll come back and check them out. If you're hearing anything that's particularly helpful or relevant or you agree with, make sure to give us a thumbs up. And if you like this video, make sure to like it and share it with your friends. So Kendall, let's go ahead and get started. Tell us more about who you are and what you do.
So I am by training a cognitive neuroscientist I wrote my dissertation on learning and memory. And basically my research looked at why we remember the things we remember and why we forget the things that we forget. And now I've taken what I've learned from my scientific background, and I'm using it to help students figure out tools and techniques and strategies that they can use so that they get the best grades that they can while also maintaining their strategy. So I don't think that I got really great grades necessarily because I'm so much smarter, but instead I think I was really strategic about how I studied. And that gave me the time and the space both to pursue other interests and get other experiences, but also to really dig deep on the topics that really, really interested me.
And the reason why I wanted to bring Kendall over is because I know students have been sharing with me that concentrating during the pandemic, studying from home, or this disrupted situation with the pandemic has been really hard for people to really focus, or their past study techniques haven't worked and they aren't sure what to do. And traditionally, people have oftentimes turn to just brute force memorization of everything possible in order to hopefully memorize something that will be related to a test. And so that's why I was particularly interested in bringing you on here to share more about your methods. So can you tell us a little bit more about first Columbia? So you went to school in Columbia, and if you can share with us, what's something that students would be surprised about regarding Columbia? And I always like to ask this question of folks who go to different colleges, because there's only so much you can get from reading the website. And nowadays people can't visit the colleges because of the pandemic. So what's something that students would be surprised about?
So I grew up in Wisconsin. And so when I moved to New York to go to school at Columbia, I was just blown away by how international the community was. Grew up in a place where basically everybody was from Wisconsin or maybe, Illinois or Michigan. And so, but when I started going to school at Columbia, my roommate was Icelandic, or is Icelandic. I made friends with people who grew up in India and Singapore and Japan and China and France and Denmark. And so and Tunisia. So I have friends from almost every continent now. And I think I learned so much about the way the world operates and just different experiences and get different perspectives or the kind of things you can't get out of a book or get out of the classroom, was just from meeting people who had such different life experiences growing up.
I think that's one of the huge benefits of going to such a diverse college in terms of the population, because you get a chance to meet people from all sorts of experiences, and they can add different perspectives that you might have never even realized existed to help shape and inform your perspectives going forward.
And also it makes it great to go, travel where, I went to Iceland. I helped a friend like throw a wedding in Iceland. And that's just like a different picture on a different country that you see when you're, going about day-to-day activities there, as opposed to just, waltzing around Iceland as tourist, which I would also really recommend.
So, for any of the families or students who have followed me for a while, you might know I was an education and abroad peer counselor when I was at UCLA. So, I am very much a proponent of travel, and even as an adult have traveled a lot, because of exactly as what Kendall is sharing, is that you can just learn so much about different cultures, different people, and yourself in those different settings. So, that's really awesome about Colombia. So, what was your personal favorite thing about going to Colombia?
One of the I have two things. First is that I was able to do, as an aspiring scientist, I was able to actually do research in the kind of top tier labs that are conducting some of the best, most important research worldwide. And so I think, again, it's kind of in the theme of different types of learning. In the same way that you learn different things about the world from having friends from around the world, you learn so much about how science takes place and the actual process of science that can only really be obtained by doing it. At least when I was in high school, science was kind of taught by science by bullet point. Just, science by slideshow. And what, getting in a lab and actually seeing people collecting data and learning about designing experiments and learning about like analyzing data and doing all that stuff, you learn so much about the process hands-on, and frankly, how messy it can be and how complicated and how sometimes things are very contradictory. So I think all those things are things that you learn, or you can only really learn by doing it and being kind of in the presence of people who are really at the top of that craft. It's kind of like being more an apprentice, I think, is probably the best way to liken it. And so that was one thing. And the second thing is, I think there's nothing like going to school in New York City. Especially, again, I grew up in Wisconsin, so it was a big shift, but I took art history classes. As everybody knows, Columbia is really strong on a core humanities program. So I took my humanities classes, and like I took art history where we had field trips regularly to go to the Met. And instead of looking at paintings and pictures and whatnot on slideshows or in books, we were looking at the real one where we could like see the paint strokes. Or teachers would like organize behind the scenes tours where they would pull out a whole bunch of prints, and we would like get to look at like these prints from like early printing techniques and just like look at them all side by side. And there's just details there that you can see in person that you'll never see in a textbook rendering. So that was just amazing. Or I remember our music hum classes, like we just went to the opera, the Metropolitan Opera, which is just different than a recording. So I just think that, and again, living in a really diverse place, there's just a lot of learning about life and how the world works that you just can't replicate any other way other than living there.
That's an incredible experience to be able to have that all firsthand, to be able to witness and see history firsthand, or to just have that real experience. And oftentimes, when people are thinking about college, they don't really think about all the other worldly experiences that they'll get. It's oftentimes my major, my classes. There's so
Yeah.
much that happens actually outside of the classroom too that helps you with learning and growing. So I love that.
I
And
think
then,
following up on that, another good thing is that people could take, I wasn't in looking at a business major, but I had friends that did amazingly cool internships. And you can only go intern at like Condé Nast if you live where Condé Nast is, or like I know of people who like intern at The Daily Show or 30 Rock, basically. They were like Kenneth. And those are just jobs that you can only get if you're in New York, where those jobs are located. So that's cool.
that's a really important factor as students. Right now, I know many seniors have received or are receiving their acceptance letters, and I've been getting a lot of emails from families asking, "Well, how do I pick? I'm not really sure what to choose." And what you just mentioned is a really important dimension to think about: is what kind of experiences might you want during the school year, right? It's like you mentioned, you can intern during the school year only if you are there physically next to the place to be able to run after class to do what you want to do. But just the environment of what kind of experiences do you want to have? Do you want to be able to run to the Met on the weekend to check out an event or check out a new display? that will only be possible if you choose a location that makes sense for that sort of experience. So I love that. So in contrast, so oftentimes we don't see this on websites. What was something that you liked least about Columbia?
So I think Columbia, like a lot of its peer institutions, is basically filled up with students who are at the top of their class and stand out in high school. You know, they've got great grades and all the extracurriculars, and they've done all sorts of amazing things. And I think sometimes on top of the usual adjustment that is um, basically, you know, starting college, leaving home, living on your own for the first time, there's also can be a really big adjustment to being amongst so many people who are as smart and as bright as you when you're really, you know, part of your identity is pretty accustomed to being that standout person. So I think that can translate in lots of different ways. I think the school can be a little bit more competitive than others. And so instead of maybe learning collaboratively as much, there definitely can be undercurrents of, you know, people wanting to be the best. And that can be difficult socially sometimes. I think it also just can take a bit of an emotional toll while students are readjusting their identities. And I think also compared to other people or friends at other universities, it seems like sometimes the attention, which I think is just a manifestation of all this, is on like grades and scores as opposed to like learning for itself. Um, so that I think is at least more prevalent at schools like Columbia. And I think, you know, you can think of a lot of peer institutions that that probably applies to as well.
I think that is such a transition for folks. Oftentimes, you are in the top of their class, and then they transition to a place where many of the other people were also top of their classes too. I remember that narrative happening in my high school regarding people uh, thinking that that is going to be a negative type of thing. And I remember some advice that my one of my teachers, Mr. Teeples, if you're watching this, shared with me was to remember that I would be a big fish in a big pond, right? So oftentimes the saying goes, "You're a big fish in a small pond," right? And then when you go to the big pond, you're small. So his reminder to me that I will be a big fish still in a big pond, and part of that just goes back to like you're saying, Kendall, of figuring out not basing your identity purely on just being the top of the class, right? And how much you can actually learn from each other. There's that nice benefit too of people have strengths in all sorts of different areas, and being able to help one another learn from each other too can be such a great experience too.
I think also something I TA'd at Columbia also because I went to grad school there. And so as a teaching assistant, it was actually interesting to watch the situation from the opposite side.
Mm.
And I think actually the students who I think flourished overall the most, not just in terms of grades, but just in terms of their well-being and the things that they were involved in, the things they were accomplishing, and also their enjoyment of school were the people who found a group of students, usually it was like, you know, cohort or a group of friends and usually in the same dorm, and really, I think, supported each other. So I guess if I were to offer some advice to future college freshmen and high schoolers, it's collaborative learning. We learn a lot socially, and teaching what you're good at and listening, you know, and receiving other people's wisdom when, you know, you're in a place where you're struggling a bit, I think can be so valuable. And I think also actually leads to flourishing in a way that maybe doesn't necessarily get captured on a CV or a resume or transcript, but results in people or young adults who after college are really well positioned to go off and do something really amazing.
I think that's such an important characteristic as well post college, right? And oftentimes people don't focus on that because when you are later on in life, people aren't asking you what your GPA was in college, right? I don't think you were ever probably asked that aside from applications that you might have for graduate school, perhaps, or something else related to maybe your first job. But even then, very rare that they'll ask you what your GPA is. And all these other skills of collaboration, learning from one another, that really goes a long way in the real world when you are actually in a work environment. And I just wanted to acknowledge some folks who are watching this on live. Teresa, thanks so much for joining. And Marilyn, thank you so much for joining. So for those of you watching live, if you have questions for Kendall, let us know. And if you are hearing anything that's particularly helpful, make sure to share a thumbs up so we know that what was helpful as we go through. So Kendall, let me go ahead and switch a little bit here to a different topic. So you work with helping students study more effectively. Why did you decide to specialize in this?
Yeah, so it was out of interest of brevity. I skipped over an important step in my in my bio. And that when I graduated high school, I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison immediately after I graduated. And I was the unusual English major that was taking graduate level neuroscience classes for her electives. And I just, but my freshman year of college, I think it's sort of a byproduct of high school becoming pretty easily. And I didn't really need to have great study skills. I had my first year of college and I kind of was floundering a bit because in high school, I felt like life was pretty structured. Um, and it was like my teachers did a lot of scaffolding for me. So it was like pretty obvious what I need to be doing. And I just kind of did it. But all of a sudden I started college and that scaffolding was gone. And I would say I really had a pretty bumpy, at least academically, my first year, definitely first semester, was really pretty rough. However, I got through it just fine. I figured it all out, pulled myself together. And when I realized I wanted to go back to school to be a scientist, I went to Columbia. But at that point, I had the advantage of both having, frankly, a lot more practice being a college student. I had I had work experience at that point, and I also got to travel the world a bit. But I think all those skills, like I pulled together, and I just knew how to go about being a student and being really strategic. And so consequently, I was able to get really, really, really top grades. I got to work in this like research opportunity that was just fantastic. And I learned so much there. I was still part of some other clubs kind of tangentially, but not in a really huge time investment way. But I got to like hang out with my friends and actually have a great time and go explore New York City and get a full night's sleep. And it was not because I got magically smarter between, the first go around and my second go around of college. It was really just because I knew how to essentially have the time management skills and the study skills and the sort of the adulting skills, like the young adult skills, were in place. And so I knew how to navigate the system so that I put myself in a position to excel. However, the great news is that all of those skills are actually very learnable and very trainable. And what I find is that it's not ideal to try to learn those skills in the middle of your freshman year, and particularly not on the fly, and particularly not without guidance. So what I like to do is actually help high school students basically develop the skills at that sort of point in their life, so that instead of those skills being things that they're trying to actively implement, it just becomes kind of a habit.
It's something that I found really interesting during the pandemic with
Mhm.
the students that I'm working with is that essentially this situation threw them into a college-like environment suddenly, right? So at least when you graduate college, you're going graduate high school, you're going to college, things are going to be different. For students in high school where the pandemic just cut things short and suddenly they had to be much more independent than they were before, had to read much more at home, had to manage their schedule in a different way. Many students really struggled with that transition or are continuing to still struggle with that transition. And so I've been getting emails from parents and from students asking about how to study more effectively, how to manage their time more effectively. So I think what you're sharing is particularly timely because there's still so many people struggling with this. So when we're talking about studying and effectively studying, what does that actually mean?
Yeah. So I think usually when I think of things being more effective, I'm usually thinking along two different dimensions. So one is how long does it take you to do whatever you need to do? And then how kind of well are you doing what you need to do? And so I think studying effectively is figuring out the right space to be in that sort of area. So part of what studying more effectively is just not doing things that are inefficient. What you can do then is take all of the time, all the things that you're used to doing. Like if it historically would take me 13 hours to study for a particular exam, if I can cut that down to 7 or 8 hours, there's no getting around, you have to study, right? But if I can cut that down in half and still get the same grade, I think that's more effective. The other aspect of more effective is that once you have enough control over your time, that actually also gives you time and space to, instead of just like cursorily getting by and doing just what you need to do and getting your tests in, your papers in and everything just in time. I thought I was able to actually write better papers because I was able to get them started a little earlier. And I was able to kind of go more in depth on research projects because I had the space and time and I was interested, and allowed me to like take like extra time to read papers for example, for the lab I was researching in. I could read the papers so I could show up to lab meeting prepared. And if I was just like skimming by, if I didn't have the time to like really put some depth into my learning, I think I would have missed out on a lot of the most important learning that I did. It's not realistic to kind of put that degree of depth into everything you're learning because, there is a constraint on the number of hours in a week. But it did allow me to strategically say, no, I'm really excited by these areas or these topics, and be able to seek out seminars and extra things going on in those areas because they were so exciting.
Sounds like it gave you time freedom. It also
Mhm.
cut down, like you mentioned, the amount of time you need to study for particular things and that retention, right? So it sounds like the retention of information. A lot of times I'm hearing students are studying, 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 or they think they're studying, which basically sometimes is just brute force memorization, yet they have trouble remembering, recalling during a test, right? And so can you share a little bit more about how you actually help the students and how things
Yeah.
might be a little bit different?
Well, let's see. There's a lot we could do here, but one thing which I think we all kind of know is that if you are reading something, for example, rule number one, and I don't like so many rules. A lot of what I like to do is teach students how to be more strategic, or it's actually what we call in science is like one's metacognitive abilities, which is basically your ability to look inward and have introspection and think about how you're thinking and how you're feeling and how your inner life is, and use that information to guide how you spend your time and what your decisions are. However, I do have one rule, which is that you can only read anything one time. So for example, you're only allowed to read your textbook once. And I think a lot of times students are like, oh, I know I'm going to study. I'm just going to read this textbook over and over and over. And it is a terrible way to improve your memory. So we know though, from a whole bunch of research looking at learning, is that the neurotransmitter dopamine is really, really important for learning from feedback. It helps in two different ways. It helps basically make things more habitual, the way that you do things. And it also helps to basically take memories that might be forgotten, and it tags them to say, hey, no, this is an important memory you want to remember. Like, try to make this one of those memories that is durable and it's going to last. And so one way that you can then basically take the advantage of this thing that dopamine is doing is by, whenever possible, quizzing yourself instead of just passively reading something. So in some classes, this translates really well into flashcards. In other classes, I oftentimes would just like have all the keywords and just like write those out, but coming up with ways that you can strategically quiz yourself, where you have to essentially see the question or see the prompt and generate the answer and then get feedback on it, is a really fantastic way to basically take that memory that was likely to be kind of a flimsy memory and turn it into a really durable memory.
What's really interesting in this approach is that it combines the art and science of neuroscience and uses our natural capabilities, the way in which we are wired to remember information, and applying it to school, right? Applying it to the way in which you form habits, the way in which you recall information. And so I think what's very interesting about this approach is even just the first notion you said is read things once. I'm sure people who read or heard this are probably reacting to thinking, what? I keep reading it over and over again in hopes that through osmosis, like something will just, or diffusion, all the information will come through.
It is
And
that.
yeah, and it doesn't work that way. I think people sometimes sleep on top of their textbooks in hopes that some of it will come in. And so approaching it in a different way and approaching it in this way where you're relying on your natural capabilities and abilities, I think is really fascinating. So with remote learning and what's happening now, what are some things you're noticing are happening and things students should be mindful of as they're trying to study?
Well, one thing, I'm going to actually talk about remote learning on the online Zoom experience first. And one thing that's different between when you're going to school online, you're spending basically your whole day sitting at one place, probably staring at a Zoom screen, probably getting a little bored and fidgety. Now you can contrast that to what your daily life would look like if class were in person. And that would happen is you'd probably, enter the school day, you'd sit around and chat with your friends while, you're like waiting for class to begin. Then you'd scurry off to class and you'd be in a context, one particular classroom. You'd be there for a while and you'd get up and you'd have a context shift. You'd probably walk around, you'd probably chat with your friends, and then you would go to another classroom. So that actually, that moving around, that interaction, that nice break, those are actually all things that are helping your both memory and also your attention. So there's one really important finding that's probably one of the most durable, most consistent findings that we find in the entirety of memory research. And that's something that we call primacy. Primacy is super simple. Whenever you start an encoding session, you remember the stuff that you learned at the beginning best. And basically, as that session continues, your ability to remember things pretty rapidly declines and then stays pretty low. And that is just something that when you are sitting at a Zoom screen all day, not moving around, you are in one context, you're in one encoding space, and you are not taking advantage of your brain's natural ability to basically have this primacy happen over and over and over throughout your day. And so if I talk to people, I've been talking to students, and it sounds like Zoom breaks tend to be either 5 minutes, 15 minutes, or 30 minutes long. So if it were me, what I would want to do is to try to utilize that 5 minutes as a reset period. Don't try to get anything done. Don't look at a screen if you can. Have a dance break, talk to your mom. Honestly, if it were me, I would probably not text your friends, but I would get a group call on with your best friends and just chat. Be like, hey, what's new? This just happened. Did you see that on TV? Have you seen this? Like, have that chatter. Oh, by the way, when he said that in class, did he really say that? No. He didn't say, oh, he said this. Okay, great. Whatever that normal hallway chatter is, just try to have it not looking at a screen. This is going to provide just like a natural break that is at least going to help on the encoding primacy effect, give you a little bit more of that. Number 2 strategy. If you can walk outside, like take your dog for a walk, I think that's actually going to be better. So if you can do it. Number 2 is that when your brain consolidates information, normally tries to consolidate things according to its context. So you have your math context in a math room, and you have your science context in a science lab. And that contextual information, just like literally it's being in a different room, will help those memories consolidate together as like distinct entities. Now, if you are just staring at a classroom Zoom screen, I don't think there's as much contextual differentiation there, which means it's going to make it so that those memories aren't consolidating into like their own distinct entities, which is just going to cause memory troubles later. So if you have the space and the ability to do so, I would try to somehow give yourself a different context for each class, or at least the classes that you're struggling with. So for example, if you have a dining room, be like, all right, I'm going to do math in the dining room, and then I'm going to move up to my bedroom for bio, and then I'm going to do AP English. I'm going to move to like a different place in my room, or you know what I mean? Do what you can to kind of take advantage of that contextualization, and always take that class in that space so that those linked memories, part of what makes your bio memories stick to other bio memories is that they occurred in the same space. And so you can kind of try to artificially create that even in a remote environment.
It's so interesting in terms of changing, and it makes sense, right? You will recall different things depending upon which situation you're in. Oh, I was in bio class when I was learning this particular thing. I was staring at this poster when the teacher said this item. And for students who might have space constraints, maybe alternatives could be having different things on your table during different classes, right? So having a visual to be able to attach that memory to, or having favorite ornaments around, or lighting a candle during certain classes, right? To trigger other senses as well. If you can't physically move to other spaces, if you've got other classmates or other siblings who are in their classes as well, or you have parents working from home, but there are things you could do to change up your environment, even opening up your window a little bit more in certain classes, right?
Just like moving your desk around a little bit. Like I, definitely took, if it were me, like I'd do one class on the couch, one class facing out the window, and one class, kind of tucked in the corner. And like, even if you're just in one room, rotating around a little bit will be at least a little bit of help. So.
Yep, I think that's such an interesting thing. The one thing I recommend students not do is class or homework on their beds, because they're just too comfy and you associate that with sleep. And so oftentimes people fall asleep on the bed. So being able just to even move around, I like that notion of just moving around on your desk in different places or just on different sides can really help with that memory. So For students who are really finding it difficult to concentrate right now, and I know memory has a lot to do with concentration and motivation. So for students who are feeling that it's difficult to concentrate or they're feeling demotivated or have challenges with time management while working in this remote setting, what are some of your tips around that?
Okay, so first, I just want to put out a caveat that adolescents are particularly prone to developing mood disorders. And also, a global pandemic is a pretty good trigger for a mood disorder. There's a lot of teenagers right now who are experiencing mood disorders or different diagnoses like depression or anxiety. And those symptoms are all symptoms of a mood disorder. So if this is something that you're really struggling with, I think the first thing I would do is just see if you can even find like a simple online screening form and just screen yourself and just make sure that there's nothing more like a root cause that needs to be addressed first. So that I think would be my first just caveat. As far as what was the first question? It was about attention.
Yeah, so and then just to add to that caveat too, so calling your pediatrician or having your parents call your pediatrician just to have that conversation and check would always be helpful. And then if it turns out that that is the case, but you're still looking for tips, this is around concentration, motivation, and time management. So especially in a remote setting, any tips that you have for students around that?
So in the domain of attention, one thing is that attention is one of those things that it's a bit like a muscle. And so it is a skill that you can gradually increase your ability to pay attention. And so I think a lot of students right now are very frustrated because this time last year they could easily focus for 35, 45 minutes with really no trouble. However, this muscle I think has been drastically atrophied over the past year for a lot of students. And so if it were me, the thing I would recommend is to just start documenting how long you're able to pay attention for. Oh, I have to put out a caveat first. First, you know what your big distractions are. It's probably your phone, it's probably other sites on the web. So keeping those distractions to a minimum, either by just keeping your phone in another room or alternatively, putting up something like Freedom, which is an app that you can use to, make sure that you don't have access to the most distracting sites like Facebook or whatnot, can be really helpful just to make the environment a bit more conducive to focusing. However, what I recommend doing then is just starting an assignment or something and setting a timer and seeing how long you can go. And in the beginning, you might be like 7, 8, 9, 10 minutes, and that's okay. So then what you want to do is for maybe the rest of the day, say, okay, I'm going to operate in 7-minute chunks. And that's okay right now. And so what I like to do also, just personally, I find it motivating, is whenever I have an assignment that I have to do, people chronically underestimate how long assignments are going to take. So I would just usually write down like a star or something, being like, oh, that was a star meant X number of minutes. And I would see how long it took me to do things. So just kind of keeping track of that is, I think, also a really useful tip. But if you're going through and saying, okay, I'm going to work for 7 minutes and then I'm going to take a break. And then I'm going to do another 7 minutes and I'm going to take a break. And then the next day, be like, all right, now I'm going to set my timer for 8 minutes. And then, slowly just ramp that up. And I think it's just a moment to be really, really gentle with yourself and say, hey, right now you're at a 7-minute mark. And that's okay. You just have to say like, okay, maybe by the end of the week or by this time next week, I'm going to try to be at like 8 or 9 minutes. So that's a few things. Another thing is that when you're distracted, I think it can be helpful to think about what kind of distracted are you? Are you always thinking about the same thing over and over? Are you, just drawn to a beeping device that, is your friends buzzing you? Are you like, try to look and say, is there a pattern? Am I hungry? If you're hungry, go eat. But anyways, looking to see if there's some sort of trigger that's causing the distraction. So I think that's that. I think for high school students, they usually recommend maxing out at 25 minutes and then taking a 5-minute break. So once you get your attention kind of back up to where it has been historically, work for 25 minutes, take a 5-minute Harry Styles or Lizzo dance break, and then, sit back down. And that's going to help with a couple things. That's going to give you your primacy boost again. But also your attention is just going to be sharper at the beginning. And then also over time, even if you have, 3 or 4 25-minute sort of attentional blocks that you're doing, the amount of your attention at that fourth block is always going to be less than it is at the first block. And this is something that I was in denial with for a long time personally. It's like, no, I can power through. But the fact of the matter is that over time, your attention is decreasing. So trying to arrange your day so you're not, trying to do 6 hours of studying after a day spent on Zoom is 100% recommended.
Coming back to that point of people oftentimes overestimate or underestimate how
Yeah.
much time it'll take them to do work. One thing I recommend my students to do as they're writing out their schedules and they write down how much they think, I say, rule of thumb, double that for this first go, and then let's calibrate against what actually happened.
Yeah.
And then that second thing there regarding your efficacy declining over time, I remember I was speaking with a student asking them, how long did it take you to read that one page? Because they were telling me about how much they were studying. And that one page took them 20 or so minutes. And that's a sign that maybe it's time for a break, right? You
Yeah.
might be daydreaming or you might have read it over and over again. But if you're stuck on that same page for that long, it's probably time to change something, right? And then come back to it. So some of these signs being just more aware that you might get more distracted in this situation, even if it seems like there are less distractions because we're stuck at home. The distractions are different, right? And coming back to your devices, they're designed to be addictive, right? The apps that we have, they're designed to show that little alert so that you go and check it. Now you've got that habit formation of that little red bubble showing and you want to check it, or that ding. And so the other, I say, last resort for folks is to hand the phone over to a parent or a trusted sibling. And if they really want to be serious, delete the app from their screen. And that is the one that freaks out people the most, which is interesting because your data will be saved and you could just download the app again, right? And that's fine. But as a distract, to really eliminate that distraction, sometimes that extra step to have to re-download that app can be
Yeah.
enough to prevent you from having to go on it.
Yeah. Oh, I think it's really difficult. I think that actually applies also during Zoom classes. My understanding is that the distractions and paying attention like during a Zoom class is much, much harder than it is when you're all in person.
Mhm.
And so I think that's a time, I think, and that's actually something really important for college prep is that when you're in college, there's a lot less monitoring over how much you're paying attention. And so I think the students who really, really succeed in college are ones who know how to do as much learning as possible while they're seated in that lecture, as opposed to being like, oh, I didn't quite get that, or I drifted off. So it's no problem. I'll figure it out after class while I'm studying. And that's just not efficient. And so how do you maximize learning and your attention using that same sort of like laser focus? I actually really like the idea of being like, I'm gonna have these short little windows when I'm laser focused. And then I'm going to give myself great latitude in those other periods where I give myself a complete break. Because I think we oftentimes are like, well, if I'm going to get the best grades, I have to be working super hard. And there's something like, if it's not grueling, I'm not going to be getting the best grades that I can get. And counterintuitively, it was hard for me to learn too. It's like, if I'm totally hyperextended and I'm working way too much and way too long, it's actually causing most things in my life to go down to 75, 85%. And so it's a hard thing to learn. So it's like, oh, actually, to learn this better, I have to take a break and take some time off and step away. But it's, I think, a life lesson well worth learning.
And as you're sharing that, it reminded me of a story of a student that I worked with who would get into battles with his father because he was a straight A student and easily understood the material, that he just had a really effective way to study and a really effective way to absorb information. And so he got great grades, great participation in class, was active in school, but played a lot of video games because he had a lot of extra time. So he was able to play games and talk with his friends. And his father was really worried that he should be studying more. And I remember the son asking me, well, what am I supposed to study? I already understand all the material. I've gotten good grades, but my dad thinks I need to be working harder. So just even that narrative of what effective looks like or what harder studying looks like, I think is a good thing to challenge, because
Yeah.
sometimes the staring at the book endlessly is not necessarily the best thing to do. And we absorb information in different ways. And so it shouldn't be a bad thing if someone is able to be effective in their studying. And like you just mentioned at the beginning, now have time freedom to do other things that they'd like because they took care of what needed to be taken care of.
My dissertation is actually was looking at how when we encode things, there's oftentimes these breaks afterwards. And we looked at basically how important those periods of time after you encode something and you're functionally staring off into space, how important those memories were for promoting remembering the important things and actually forgetting the unimportant things. Because you don't want to remember everything. That's, that's terrible if you remember everything. You really want to remember like the important stuff and have it all kind of like logically make sense with itself. So which is, that those little rest breaks are really, really important for memory consolidation.
It's super helpful. And I see a couple more people joining on live. So every time you see me looking down or to the side, it's because I'm checking out Facebook Live where people are watching live. If you've got questions, let us know in the comments. And if you're hearing anything that's particularly helpful, make sure to give us a thumbs up. And again, if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure to like and share this with your friends. So Kendall, tell us now, we're in this interesting time of the pandemic where we're transitioning now to a new phase with the vaccinations rolling out. And so as students are starting to look towards coming back to school and going back into that normal setting, what are some things they should be keeping in mind during this transition to continue to study more effectively?
Well, one really important thing is that I know that this kind of time of the year is when schedules get set for next year. And even though it's kind of hard to be thinking about, being back in school and being back in a class, right now I think is actually one of the most important times to determine your success for next year. In that I think students sometimes don't do well when they're not challenged enough. And I think students don't perform well overall when they're way overextended and don't have those times to like take a break and consolidate and to think about information, and are kind of doing way more than is capable for like one person to get done a week, and like their whole academic experience suffers and their emotional well-being suffers. So I think being really strategic about making plans for next year, and thinking about how do you set up your schedule so that you're challenged but not overwhelmed. How are you making sure that your extracurriculars are things that you're really learning from and really gaining from, and not just like doing which I was entirely guilty of when I was in high school, by the way, of doing extracurriculars just for the sake of doing extracurriculars. But I think right now, probably the biggest recommendation I can give for success next year is to really be honest and realistic about what you're doing and see what you can do to plan your schedule to really maximize that.
I know some students who are really thinking about just overloading themselves with as many advanced placement classes and honors classes as possible now that they're going to go back to school in a regular setting, and being able to just kind of think through how did things go for you this year, and recognizing that this will still be a transition and it's not necessarily going to be just easier because you're in real life classes, and to just be mindful of being able to have those other elements. One thing I always ask my students, especially the ones that I work with one-on-one, is trying to better understand how much time are they actually sleeping. Two questions I ask all of my students: how much time do you need to be the optimal you, the best version of yourself every day? And then how many hours of sleep did you actually get last night? So it's a good calibration, right? To see whether or not they're honoring and respecting actually what their body needs to be the best version of themselves. And then thinking about that backwards, if you are the type of person who needs 10 hours of sleep or 8 hours of sleep, like most people do, then looking backwards of how much time did it actually take you to accomplish all of your assignments? How many hours did it take you to read these chapters? And let's now forecast to next year, looking back at the things you want to accomplish extracurricularly, the things you might want to do in terms of sports or whatever it is, and then balancing all these different things. What's realistic to actually fit in your schedule? Because I think what students might also be at risk of is additional burnout in different ways, right? People are burning out on Zoom or burning out on distance learning, and being able to transition back, there's also risk of a different kind of burnout in that process as well.
Yeah, and I think I've talked to several students who I think were like, well, this year was kind of a wash. Like I just didn't have like this great academic year because of the pandemic. And their response to that is like, well, I'm going to take all of the courses next year. And it's like, nope, that is not how years work. Like, I need to be really realistic. And I think one of the stories that I tell is that from that kind of those years at Columbia where I really just got great grades, I also was like, I was taking hard classes and I was not in any way skimping, but I also was not one of those people who just like threw on, like 2 extra seminars for fun, right? So I was taking probably 16, 17 credits, but I had friends that were taking 20 credits. And there's just no way that you are going to be able to excel, put the same amount of time into each of those courses that they require if you're spread out if you're doing 20 credits instead of say 16 or 17 credits. Also, I didn't do a gazillion extracurriculars. I got one extracurricular that was like this really thing that I was genuinely passionate about, and I was learning a lot, and I was like growing as an adult, honestly, um, doing the work in the research lab. And it wasn't like, I think also sometimes students think like, oh, it's like the volume of things that you're doing that really helps you stand out. But I think being really, really stand out in one facet is sometimes far more impressive, because it was like being able to really invest time into that research lab. The faculty member who ran the lab, she was offered, I didn't even ask for it. She was like, do you want a paid job when you're done? And so I was like, yes, I do. And I was took a paid research position, took then a paid lab manager position immediately thereafter, which then turned into a grad school job, which then, you know what I mean? Like it's basically having the time and energy to invest into like, not be so spread thin allowed me to really invest in those opportunities that were really the activities that opened the doors. So I think thinking about that kind of energy trade-off. Your energy is a precious resource. So make sure that you're spending it in, not becoming spread so thin that you can't be strategic about how you spend it.
And I love that you said that because, in terms of my approach as a college admissions career coach, it's really around this holistic approach. And it's not just trying to get perfect everything, it's figuring out what impact you want to make, what passions you've got, and then exploring that through your classes, exploring that through your extracurriculars. And as someone who was on an admissions team, I was part of the admissions team for UC Berkeley. It wasn't the student who did every single thing. You really are looking for depth. What kind of impact did they make? What did they do over time? How did they grow in responsibility over time?
Mhm.
What my recommenders have said regarding the impact they made on certain things, right? So it's not so much of doing one of everything, but more of going into what you're more passionate about, and showing growth over time is usually what people are looking for. So Kendall, if students are interested in working with you, or families are interested in learning more about you, where should they go?
So you should Google, or you should go to www.faulkner, Faulkner Academic Strategies .com, and or email me at Kendall at faulkneracademicstrategies.com. And basically, I right now am doing a bunch of free events. I love connecting with high schoolers and their families. So I'm doing everything from career chats where I talk about, the career trajectories of majoring in a scientific degree, or alternatively pursuing a career in science, where the trade-offs and things that you can be thinking about now as a high schooler to see if that's like the right fit for you. I also am having a webinar that I'm hosting later this month. And the webinar is basically looking at stress and memory. And we know a great deal about how stress impacts memory, both to make it better and make it worse. And obviously, it's been a very stressful year. So I think understanding how those things work can be really insightful. So I think that's a great webinar for both parents and their and high schoolers. And then also, I teach a course that basically looks at the interplay between how the brain works, and then uses that and my own personal experiences to come up with strategies for basically improving how students study. We look at everything from different encoding strategies. We talk about utilizing consolidation more effectively. We talk about different retrieval strategies. And the course usually runs about 6 weeks. The first part is a day that's mostly lecture and discussion, where we look at a big, broad overview. And then each week after that, we have what I refer to as a scientist, as little experiments, where I give students different metacognitive strategies that they can use in their own school year within this week, to look at to see if they can, I would say, start honing their own metacognition or their own strategies that they can employ to basically develop this toolkit of strategies that they're going to need in college and frankly as adults. And so then we meet once a week where we talk about those, we have discussions, we learn some more about the brain. We usually have some writing exercises, because journaling is this great opportunity to have an opportunity for metacognition, where it's like a little bit outside you, but you don't have to share it with anybody. And so it's 6 weeks long, and that will be opening up later this month, the next cohort. In addition to that, I'm also taking on a limited number of pods where I'm working with an academic pod that isn't doing sort of standard school, and I have a short-term sort of cognitive neuroscience 101, where we also employ basically some of this learning along the way, but it's a lot more in depth about learning more about the brain. We do a lot more neuroscience. And as somebody who used to lecture at Columbia, I've written Columbia exams, I've written and graded Columbia term papers. A lot of those programs are also have a component. I will tailor the program to the pod, but a lot of the programs are like, let's practice doing college this year, where we could do a lot of scaffolding, learning how to operate in a college-like academic setting, where we can have college-like standards and no one's really taking grades, so it's fine. And basically that is an opportunity that I have a few spots that's still available for. So for those opportunities, you should email me, and I'm sure we can post that again somewhere. But otherwise, to sign up for the email list is how you can learn about any of the speaking opportunities that are coming up. And if you just sign up for the email, you'll get emails about all of it. Oh, and another thing I do is every week I have, or almost every week, I have an hour set aside in the week where I have what's called office hours. And for anybody who is in high school, office hours are basically a time where a faculty member sits in their office and the door is open for you to stop on and talk about class material, career advice. In my office hours, I basically am sitting there. Sometimes nobody shows up, so I love it when people drop in. But I've talked about everything from feminism to the Electoral College. We've talked about music and books and travel, a lot about career advice, study advice. And sometimes I think students just need someone to talk to. So for the office hours, priority always goes to high school students, but I encourage anybody who just wants to drop in because oftentimes nobody shows up.
So we'll make sure to add those links in the comments for YouTube, and we'll put it in the Facebook Live links as well, so people can check out your offerings. So one of the reasons why I was super interested in interviewing Kendall today is, as my followers know, neuroscience leadership is something that I oftentimes teach my students. And it's something where Kendall and I really aligned on how do we use the brain and the natural abilities of the brain to be able to just approach things differently and to really tap into that power to be able to be more effective in the work that we do and showing up as our true selves. So Kendall, anything else that you'd like to leave our listeners with before we go?
So this is has nothing to do with neuroscience, but I think this year has been a strange year for everybody. And I think that a lot of the students I've been talking to feel really frustrated that they're not, doing the bio labs that they thought they were going to be doing, and they're not, doing a lot of the experiences that they thought they were going to be having. But I think it also flipped another way. It's a strange opportunity for learning in a different way. And I think there's all sorts of skills that you'll have the opportunity to learn, like resilience and learning some grit and learning to kind of make do in unusual circumstances. And so as I grown older, the more I think I've recognized how there's sometimes life throws you curveballs that there's nothing you can do about and there's nothing you can fix. And I think as a high schooler, I thought that if as long as I kind of fell along this like particular trajectory and I go to the right schools and I get the right grades and I get like the right degrees, I'd have everything would be like right. And that's not the way the world works. So I think, the world throws curveballs and we kind of have to figure out how to make the best of those curveballs that are thrown. So I apologize that you have to learn this lesson right now, but I think it's an important thing that you're learning nonetheless. And so and I know it's frustrating and I know it's upsetting and I feel all the feels with you, but I guess I just want to encourage students to think about some of the hidden advantages that they might be learning in like the life skills that they might be learning this year that they might not otherwise have the opportunity to learn for a long time.
I tell my students in high school and the ones that are in college now that they'll develop a resiliency that no other generation has had to endure, right? They have had to go through something that no one else has ever, no other generation has ever had to deal with, an entire world shut down, right? And the type of skills and the type of stories that they'll have in the future are going to be unlike any other, and to give themselves the grace of this pause. And while things were not as they had intended, and may not have been maybe the senior year they would have envisioned, or the first year of college they would have envisioned, this will be a moment in time of a long lifetime that they'll have, that will just build so much resiliency and grit that no other generation will have. So Kendall, it was such a wonderful experience being able to have this conversation with you. And so for those of you who are watching this live or on the replay, we want to turn this over to you. Let us know in the comments, what was your biggest takeaway from this conversation? We covered a lot of different perspectives regarding how you can study more effectively, efficiently, what that might look like, and concrete steps that you can take. So let us know your biggest takeaway in the comments below. Kendall and I will come back and take a look at them. If you got any questions, also let us know in the comments. So if you found this helpful, make sure to like the video and share it with your friends, and I will see you in our next episode. Thanks so much for watching.